This chapter should seem fairly familiar. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff you've seen before, but we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into it. So example 1 says find the distance between the 2 points. So we want to take a line from this point, draw to this point, and we want to know the length of that line. We're looking for the distance between the 2 points. So one way we can do this is make a right triangle. So we can draw a right triangle that makes that line its hypotenuse. And now we can use the Pythagorean theorem because we can just count the distance along these sides. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that is a distance of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. That's a distance of 8. Then we can set up the Pythagorean theorem. A squared plus b squared equals c squared, where c is the hypotenuse. Actually, let's do d, since we're talking about distance. So normally we would do c. Let's do d squared. And then we have, if we plug in, we have 6 squared plus 8 squared equals d squared. That's 36 plus 64 equals d squared, so that's 100 equals d squared. But we don't want to know what d squared is, we want d. So let's take the square root of both sides, and we get 10 for this distance. Let's look a little bit more in depth into what we did before we go into example 2. So when we found that 6, we counted. We just counted on the graph. But let's look a little more in depth into what exactly it was that we were doing. So when we counted that 6, we were counting the distance between an x value of -4 and an x value of 2. We were counting the distance between those two things. And so when we're finding distance, a way we can do that is by subtracting the numbers. So if we subtract, if we do 2, the y value, or the x value on the right, minus the x value on the left, -4, we get 2 minus -4, that's the same as 2 plus 4, that's 6. And so we can get the distance just by subtracting. And you could do it the other way. You could say -4 minus 2 is -6, and then since we're talking about distance, use the absolute value. Either way, you should get an absolute value of 6. And so what we did here, we could say, we took some x values, call it x2, and we subtracted some other x value, call it x1. We did the same thing for the y values. So if we look at this y value here, so the top point has a y value of 3, the bottom point has a y value of -5. We want to know the distance between those two things. Well, we counted it to be 8, but again, we could have just subtracted. We could have said this is a y value of 3 minus a y value of -5. 3 plus 5 then is 8. And so what we did is we took some y value, call it y2, and we subtracted some other y value, call it y1. Now let's look at example 2. So we have just any random points. We don't have actual numbers this time. We're trying to generalize this formula. So let's see what we can do here. Let's draw a triangle just as before. So we're looking for the distance between those two. So I'm going to draw a right triangle. And by the way, you could draw this right triangle either on top or on bottom. It wouldn't really matter. I'm going to draw it on top this time. And now let's look at the distances. So on the top, we could say that the distance between this x value and this x value is x2 minus x1. So here we get x2 minus x1. We're going to subtract the x values to get that. And for the vertical distance, we can take this y value and this y value and subtract those, and we can get y2 minus y1. So then if we use the Pythagorean theorem, we have, so it's a squared plus b squared equals, and again I'll call it d squared. So a, we could say that's the difference in x values, that's x2 minus x1. So we can take x2, and this thing's not working, there we go. Okay, x2 minus x1 squared plus the difference in y values, which is y2 minus y1 squared equals the distance squared. But we don't want the distance squared, we want just the distance, regular distance. So let's take the square root of both sides. And then we get a formula that should look familiar. This is the distance formula. So the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. That is the distance formula. So when you're asked to find the distance between 2 points, you can just use the Pythagorean theorem, or if you can remember the distance formula, you can just plug them into the formula and it will do the Pythagorean theorem for you. Let's look at example 3. Now we're asked to take these 2 points and find the midpoint. Well, the midpoint is the point that is exactly halfway between. So we can take the segment here and we want to know the point that's exactly halfway between. Well, just eyeballing it, you can probably tell that it's going to be the point -1, 1. But it won't be so obvious in all situations. So let's look at what's happening here. So if we want to know the midpoint of that, we can split it into 2 components. We can say, let's find the middle of the x values, and then let's find the middle of the y values. So for the x values, we can say, well, look at this x value of -4, look at this x value of 2. Let's find the halfway point between those. Well, how do you find the halfway point between 2 numbers? You average them. So we're going to take -4 plus 2 and divide by 2. We're going to average the 2 x coordinates. So that's -2 over 2 equals -1. So that tells us that our x coordinate is -1. And then we're going to have some y coordinate. We'll find that in a minute. Actually, right now. So if I look at this y value and this y value and try to find the halfway point between those, well, I can average the y values. Let's take the top one as 3, then plus the bottom one, which is -5, divide by 2. 3 plus -5 is -2, divided by 2 is -1. So we get a y value of -1. And you can see that if I draw in that halfway point, -1, between the blue ones, that is a y value of -1. And if I look at the halfway point between the green ones, that's also an x equals -1. And the point where they meet right here, that is the midpoint of the segment. So, midpoint formula, you just average the x and y coordinates. So let's write this out in general terms. So if I want to find the halfway point between the x values here, I just average the x coordinates. So for the x coordinate, I take x1 plus x2 divide by 2. That's the x coordinate. And then to get the y coordinate, we try to find the distance between those 2 horizontal lines, which is y2, well, I guess it doesn't really matter what your number there is, but you take the 2 of them and add them together and divide by 2.